The period of 1905 to 1914 was a testing time for Imperial Russia. At issue was the question of whether it could become a modern state. In 1905, the Tsarist system was shaken by the most open challenge it had yet faced. It survived, but only by making concessions to its opponents. A parliament was granted and political parties were legalized. Whether such concessions weakened or strengthened the Tsardom is still debated by historians today. The foreign policy that Nicholas II inherited and continued was largely determined by the size of the Russian Empire. The protection of its many frontiers was a constant preoccupation. In 1904, Nicholas II faced his first major test in foreign affairs when his country went to war with his far eastern neighbor, Japan. It was a war largely of Russia's own making. The Russian government had three main motives in going to war with Japan in 1904. They wanted to pursue an expansionist policy in the Far East to make up for what it saw as its relative decline in Europe. They also wanted to obtain an ice-free port, something for which Russia had yearned for centuries, all of its major ports being unusable in the winter months when they froze. They also wanted to distract attention from Russia's domestic troubles by rallying the nation in a patriotic struggle. The Russians looked on Japan as an inferior nation and no match for them. They expected an easy victory. Pretexts for wars were not hard to find. Territorial disputes between Russia and Japan over Korea and Manchuria were long-standing. In 1904, the Russian government curtly rejected Japanese proposals for the settlement for the two countries' rival claims to Korea. The Russian hope was that this would provoke a military response from the Japanese. It did. Japan opened hostilities by attacking the Russian fleet in Port Arthur. The war itself soon showed that Russia had greatly underestimated the strength of Japan. It was not the backward state the Russians had imagined. Under the Emperor Meijing, Japan had embarked upon a series of major reforms aimed at rapid modernization along Western lines. The Japanese Army and Navy were far better prepared and equipped than the Russian forces and won a series of striking victories over them. For Russia, the conflict was a tale of confusion and disaster. After a long siege, Port Arthur fell to Japan in January 1905. The following month, the Japanese exploited their advantage by seizing the key Manchurian town of Mukden. The final humiliation for Russia came at sea. The Russian Baltic Fleet, dispatched to the Far East in 1904, took 8 months to reach its destination, only to be blown out of water immediately upon its arrival by the Japanese fleet at Tsushima in May 1905. Such defeats obliged the Tsarist government to make peace. In the Treaty of Portsmouth, Russia agreed to withdraw her remaining forces from Manchuria and accepted Japanese control of Korea and Port Arthur. Russia lost the war not because her troops fought badly, but because her military commanders had not prepared effectively. They understood neither the enemy they were fighting nor the territory in which the struggle took place. Their unimaginative strategy allowed the Japanese to outmaneuver the Russian forces. The distance over which men and materials had to be moved from Western Russia made it impossible to provide adequate reinforcement and supplies. The Trans-Siberian Railway, still incomplete in a number of sections, proved of little value. Russia's defeat at the hands of a small, supposedly inferior Asian country was a national humiliation. Within Russia, the incompetence of the government, which the war glaringly revealed, excited the social unrest that had been specifically designed to dampen. Russia's dismissal performance was a potent factor in the buildup of tension, which led to an open challenge to the Tsardom, the 1905 revolution. The situation created by the government policy of political repression was graphically described by Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist and philosopher. In 1902, in an open address to Nicholas II, he detailed the persecution under which Russia groaned. Prisons were overflowing with convicts innocent of any real crime. The city streets were full of soldiers ready to shoot the people on a whim, and the censor's power stretched everywhere, denying freedom of religion and political expression. Things were no better in the countryside, where famine was a constant source of peasant misery. Presiding over this grim scene was a government that squeezed money from the people through heavy taxation, but was incapable of providing leadership. The result, Tolstoy told the Tsar, was the general dissatisfaction of all classes of the government and their open hostility against it. Tolstoy's depressing conclusion was that it is impossible to maintain this form of government except by violence. The bleak picture that Tolstoy painted did not necessarily mean that confrontation, still less revolution, was unavoidable. After all, if oppression is applied firmly enough, it prevents effective challenges to the government. What weakened the Tsarist regime in the period before 1917 was not its tyranny, but its incompetence. It is certainly true that the crisis that occurred in Russia in 1905 was in large measure due to the mishandling of the situation by the Tsar and his government. This was shown by the speed with which the government reasserted its authority once it had recovered its nerve. The year 1905 marked the first time the Tsarist government had been faced with a combination of three main opposition classes in Russia: the industrial workers, the peasantry, and the reformist middle class. This was the broad-based revolt that most revolutionaries had been awaiting, yet when it came, it was accidental rather than planned. Despite the efforts of various revolutionary parties to politicize the events, the strikes and demonstrations in the pre-1905 period had been the result of economic rather than political factors. They had been a reaction to industrial recession and bad harvests. It was the Tsarist regime's ill-judged policies that turned the disturbances of 1905 into a direct challenge to its own authority. The 1905 revolution began with what is known now as Bloody Sunday. On January 22nd, Father Grigory Gapon, an Orthodox priest, attempted to lead a peaceful march of workers and their families to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. The marchers' intention was to present a loyal petition to the Tsar, begging him to relieve their desperate conditions. However, the march induced panic in the police forces in the capital. The marchers were fired upon and charged by cavalry. The immediate reaction to Bloody Sunday in Russia at large was a widespread outbreak of disorder, which increased as the year went on. Strikes occurred in all major cities and towns. Terrorism against government officials and landlords, much of it organized by the social revolutionaries, spread to the countryside. The situation was made worse by Russia's humiliation in the war against Japan. The government was blamed for Russia's defeat, which led to further outrages, including the assassination of many officials. Public buildings in towns and large private estates in the country were attacked and burned. Land and properties were seized by peasants who then squatted in the landlords' houses. An important factor motivating the peasants was the fear that the government was about to repossess the homes of the families who had failed to pay off mortgages taken out in the post-emancipation years. The unrest and the government's difficulties in containing it encouraged the non-Russian minorities to assert themselves. Georgia declared its independence as a state. The Poles demanded autonomy, and the Jews pressed for equal rights. In May, there was even a liberal group that broke out and formed Union of Unions with the aim of organizing a broad-based alliance that would include the peasants and factory workers. The government was unable to stop it in the immediate days afterwards. By the autumn of 1905, the industrial unrest had grown into a general strike. It was in this atmosphere that the development of a particular moment occurred. In a number of cities, most notably in St. Petersburg and Moscow, workers formed themselves into an elected Soviet. The Soviets began as organizations to represent the workers' demands for better conditions, but their potential as basis for political agitation was immediately recognized by revolutionaries. The Menshevik Lev Trotsky became chairman of the St. Peter Soviet and organizer of several strikes in the capital. By October, the Tsar was faced with the most united opposition in Romanov history, but at this critical moment, the regime began to show the sense of purpose that it had so far lacked. Concession was unavoidable, but by giving ground, the government intended to divide the opposition forces which it confronted. The liberals were the first to be appeased. The Tsar issued the October Manifesto in which he accepted the creation of a legislative Duma. Since the manifesto also contained a promise to introduce a range of civil rights, including freedom of speech, assembly, and worship, and legalizing of trade unions, the liberals could claim a remarkable success. Their appetite for reform was satisfied, at least temporarily. The peasants were the next to be pacified by the announcement in November that the mortgage repayments, which had so troubled them, were to be progressively reduced and then abolished altogether. The response was an immediate drop in the number of land seizures by the peasants and a decline in the general lawlessness in the countryside. Having won over the liberals and the peasants, the government was now seriously opposed by only one major group, the industrial workers. Here the policy was not one of concession, but one of suppression. The government felt strong enough to attempt to crush the Soviets. Despite the mutinies earlier in the year, and troops who returned from the Far East at the end of the war proved loyal enough to be used against the strikers. After a 5-day siege, the headquarters of the St. Petersburg Soviet was stormed and the ringleaders, including Trotsky, were arrested. The destruction of the Moscow Soviet was even more violent. Lenin, who had been slow to take advantage of the 1905 revolution, arrived in Moscow in December, only in time to witness the flames of the gutted Soviet buildings set ablaze by government troops. With the worst of the troubles clearly over by the spring of 1906, Nicholas II again revealed his contempt for his own government and dismissed several of his different ministers. The Tsar believed that he could dispense with the services of anybody that he really wanted. A notable feature of the 1905 revolution was how minor a part was played by the revolutionaries. Hardly any of them were in St. Petersburg or Moscow when it began. Revolution occurred in spite rather than because of them. With the exception of Trotsky, none of the social revolutionaries made an impact on the course of events. This throws into doubt the notion of 1905 as a revolution. There is further fact that in a number of important respects, the Tsardom emerged from the disturbances stronger than before. Despite its disastrous failure to win the war against Japan, which produced protests throughout Russia and united the classes in opposition, the Tsarist regimes survived 1905 remarkably unscathed. The mutinies in the armed services did not spread and did not continue after the war. Loyal troops returned to destroy the Soviets. The readiness of the liberals and the peasants to accept the government's political and economic bribes indicated that neither of these groups was ready for revolution. It is true that the Tsar appeared to grant significant concessions in the October Manifesto, but these were expedient rather than real reforms. The Duma was not intended to be, nor did it become, a limitation on the Tsar's autocratic powers. What the 1905 revolution showed was that as long as the Tsarist government kept its nerve and the army remained loyal, the forces of protest would find it very difficult to mount a serious challenge. The events of 1905 also raised questions about the extent to which the liberals wanted change in Russia. Few of them enjoyed their experience mixing with the workers during the revolution. They found the proletarian coarseness unattractive and were frightened by the primitive forces they had helped to unleash. Peter Struve, who had been a Marxist before joining in 1905, spoke for all frightened liberals when he said, "Thank God for the Tsar who has saved us from the people." Trotsky reflected that the 1905 revolution had failed because the protesters were disunited and inexperienced. Moreover, the liberals had backed out of the revolution and betrayed the workers by leaving them to be crushed by government troops. He concluded that the Tsarist system, although with a few broken ribs, had come out of the experience of 1905 alive and strong.